Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bill Caruso. I run Archer & Greiner's government affairs practice, and I'm also of counsel in their law firm. My involvement in this area, prior to working in private practice, I worked in the government side of the world. I was the Chief of Staff to the United States Congressman and also ran the General Assembly staff for two speakers, Speaker Joe Roberts and the state's current Lieutenant Governor at the time, Speaker Sheila Oliver. I've been involved in marijuana policy for about 20 years through those positions, both at the federal and state level, and helped to write the current medicinal law in our state when I was the executive director. So today we're just going to really cover the basics of where we are in New Jersey, a little coverage of what's going on at the federal level, and what I'm going to try to point out to everybody here is I think Archer & Greiner is a good example of a firm that frankly got into this at a growing stage, and I'd like everybody on this call to think about this from their own business interests, that this is coming to New Jersey, and even if you don't think you're going to be representing cannabis clients, you may be representing clients that have tangential relationships now with these new cannabis clients that are going to be starting here, and we'll talk a little bit about that so you can be prepared as that is coming your way. So on our first slide, I really want to give an idea for everybody of what we're talking about right now. In a very short amount of time, in a period of about 20 years' time, this has changed drastically. In 1996 and 97, California was the only state that had even contemplated legalization at the medicinal level, meaning that you could prescribe or recommend it for medical purposes, but legalization for recreational purpose wasn't even being contemplated. And today, as we see, and really this has exploded since 2012, we have 29 legal medical marijuana states, including Washington, D.C., and 9 legal recreational marijuana states, including Washington, D.C., and that will grow exponentially this year with some ballot questions that are about to take shape. And we are hopeful that New Jersey will be among them in one of the first legislative efforts to create not only a legalized state but a commercial effort. Vermont beat us to the punch. Vermont is the first state through legislation to enact legalization. But what they haven't done is really create a commercial market. They've only allowed legalized possession, but they haven't created a commercial market or any type of regulatory scheme to allow for sales in their state. So in New Jersey, we're working now not only to expand the state's medicinal program, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes, but we're also talking about allowing for legal recreational use, and we expect that the legislature and the governor in the coming weeks are going to be moving legislation that will allow for that. Now, there are impediments. Even though there are this sort of sea change movement, we still have some impediments. And one of the biggest impediments right now is the fact that this is still legal at the federal level. And the sort of lawyer geek in me and policy wonk is intrigued by this because it is an anathema. It is an odd situation to be advocating for something at a state level that is in violation of federal law, and it has caused tremendous consternation among businesses, research institutions, state legislators, and the like on how to grapple with this issue. But there have been enough out there now, I think, in terms of states that have done this. We're going to talk a little bit about some efforts that have changed this past year at the federal level, but so far these states that have adopted both medical programs and now legalization of recreational marijuana for adults have been able to do so without much interference from the federal government. There's a lot of hoop jumping. We'll talk about some of that today, particularly on federal tax policy, but I thought as a primer, I realize people will have different varying understandings of this. This is why. And so we look at this, Schedule I drugs are the issue here, and marijuana is still a Schedule I drug. Interestingly enough, it is a Schedule I drug, even though it does have some benefit. You can see, the criteria for Schedule I drugs are high potential for abuse. There are some arguments related to addiction and whether or not cannabis is an addictive substance or not. The drug has currently no accepted medical treatment in the United States. Well, it's kind of flies in the face. So in terms of what's going on at the state level, it is not in concert with what's going on at the federal level. And there is an effort right now going on to deschedule marijuana at the federal level because it doesn't really meet with a lot of these requirements you see here. So we still are not able to, I sort of balked at the idea that we are prescribing marijuana. We aren't prescribing marijuana in our state. In other states, it's doctors recommend it. It's a technicality, but it's important because you're not allowed to prescribe. And the one other thing just to remember here, because we're not going to go too far in a field and in depth in all the different aspects of the plant, but THC in marijuana is the operative issue. That is what is banned, and so we will hear about. You may hear about the use of CBD, which is the cannabinoid substance that has some medicinal impact. That doesn't have the psychotropic high feeling that comes along with the THC side of marijuana. So there are efforts now where you're seeing CBD oils and topical creams and the like being used for medicinal and nutraceutical purposes already being sold in the United States in different jurisdictions, separate and apart from legalization. Those substances sometimes are derived from hemp, and there are relaxed issues related to growing and using hemp or for industrial purposes around the country right now. The difference, and we'll stop it at this because I'm not going to go too deep into hemp today, is hemp doesn't get you high, and CBD doesn't get you high, and doesn't have THC. So THC is the operative issue, and that is what is banned at the federal level, and that is the trouble that comes with regulating this at the state level. So giving you a sort of overview of where we are at the national level right now, let's dive a little into where we are in New Jersey as we sit here today. So in 2009, New Jersey adopted through statute the Compassionate Use Medical Marijuana Act, or CUMA. That bill was created via statute by the New Jersey legislature. It was passed, and it was done so at a time where it was viewed as sort of a groundbreaking law. This is pre-Colorado legalizing, and at a time when a lot of states had not really jumped into the medicinal world. It was more of a new frontier, and as such, Jersey struggled to get through this. It was not a political win. It was a hard-fought effort to get this passed, and it had some limitations, including a limit to home grow, and there were some questions about how edibles could be utilized, and at the time the technology was still growing. There were a lot of efforts to sort of keep a very closed, small program. And in addition to that, what happened is at the time, Governor Corzine, who was governor in signing the law, lost his reelection campaign to Governor Christie. And so a new governor came in to implement a program that had just been enacted but not yet implemented. And Governor Christie, had much different designs for that implementation. And for about a year struggled with the legislature to go back and forth on whether they would implement the law, and in turn reached a compromise that resulted into the program that we've seen up until January of this year. And it created 6 vertically integrated dispensaries. The jargon in the industry, so you understand if you don't know what that means, vertical integration means that all of the facilities are combined into sort of one entity. These dispensaries now are all operational. I know the Harmony one on our slide says operations pending, but they'll be up and running soon. They're the last one to go. They are now operating throughout the state. Now, the problem has been a supply issue, a supply issue in our state for patients. But interestingly enough, we've only had a very small amount of demand in terms of patients that have been certified. The state of 9 million people only had about 12,000 patients as of the start of 2018, prior to the change that came under the new governor. So Jersey's been behind in a lot of ways in the medicinal effort. We started out pretty well, but over the course of the last years, really didn't do much in terms of growing the program. So it seems like we're ready to boom in terms of what's about to happen in the market. Just a couple other things just for your own purposes. We're only limited right now, patients are only limited to 2 ounces per month of flower. So there are some discussions about going on about expanding that. There's no home grow permitted in our program, and there are fees for both the application on the patient side, but also significant fees on the application side for business. We can go to the next slide. In our next slide, we'll talk a little bit about where the program's going. So Governor Murphy, who campaigned on both legalization and expanding medicinal marijuana in our state, is beyond his first 100 days and has already maneuvered through his Executive Order 6, to expand medicinal. Now, he had the regulatory authority to do that. They didn't need the legislature to act. And what they've done already is just some nibbling around the edges, but it's had some profound impact. So reducing the fee for patients to $100 has helped. There's also significant discounts for veterans and seniors and some other things. New conditions have been added, including opioid abuse and a couple other conditions that were vetted by the review panel and then implemented under the governor's Department of Health a couple months ago. The doctor registry has now been streamlined and no longer requires publishing online, which caused some doctors some consternation about being involved in recommending marijuana to their patients. And that has changed now, so more doctors are involved in this. And in addition to the increasing demand, they have allowed the existing dispensaries, the current 6 that currently are here, to expand in what we'll call like satellite opportunities or franchise opportunities. I think mostly on the retail side, but there may be some additional grow capacities as well under those 6 licenses. There was a discussion about allowing new standalone licenses, but to date, the department has not acted on that, and we do expect, and I'll get to that in the future moment, an explanation of where we're headed next in terms of medical expansion. But we do anticipate new players coming into the market for medicinal expansion in the next couple weeks in terms of new guidelines being put out. We can go to the next slide. So why legalize marijuana? We just talked about what's gone on at the national level. We've talked about what's gone on the medicinal level. There are a lot of arguments for and against the legalization of adults 21 and older would be able and in certain places consume cannabis-related products for the purpose of recreation, not for medical purposes. And there's a variety of answers to that question. So, on the pure sort of fiscal side of the house, we can look at job creation. There has been significant boon in jurisdictions that have legalized marijuana because of the need to fill these jobs. And the jobs vary. There's entry-level, sort of Starbucks-like baristas that are working behind a counter, have to be trained and knowledgeable about the products you're selling. By the way, in these jurisdictions like Nevada and Colorado, are paying way above minimum wage, sometimes as much as $15 an hour with benefits, even for the retail workers. There's also a science component to this, a lab component to this, and on the processing side in particular, there's a lot of chemistry involved in this. So folks with a bachelor's degree or some community college work in chemistry and other assorted sciences come in handy. There's obviously the agricultural side of the world and the grow facilities. But there is tremendous opportunity for all sorts of employment related to security. We see a lot of ex-military that are coming back from service or ex-law enforcement personnel that are involved on the security side. So the job creation side of this is very compelling, both from a policy perspective for the lawmaker side,
in elected official side, but also in selling this to the public and the community. Revenue. There's no shortage of revenue coming in from cannabis, from legal cannabis sales. And Colorado is the best example of that. Colorado, we're not talking about life-changing money. We're not talking about, pave every road in your state money, but we are talking about significant program money, the ability to piece off money that would help in certain program efforts, both around, public education around cannabis, and there's been efforts on anti-drug efforts to fund those through cannabis revenue, but in addition to other things, children's health, schools, school funding, and the like. And the wonderful part about this is it's not a property tax. It's not an income tax. It's a tax that, frankly, you choose to pay if you choose to use. So it seems to be a very popular revenue source in a state like New Jersey where we are overtaxed. This seems like a palatable revenue source for a lot of folks. We'll talk about that in polling when we get to that. Now, research and development. This is a real neat one. We are a pharma economy. We are an agriculture economy, and the research and development going on in that area, in those sectors, in this space is incredible. And the ability to attract into New Jersey because of our proximity to wealth, because of our proximity to phenomenal transportation, because of our proximity to some of the finest healthcare and research institutions in New Jersey, and frankly on the agricultural side, our proximity to just unbelievable both agricultural resources and research resources through Rutgers and other institutions, we're primed to attract companies currently sitting offshore in Israel, Canada, India, Colombia, and other jurisdictions that will want to locate here to be the next pharma company that are looking at drugs derivative of cannabis, or looking at the ability to understand more from a agricultural research standpoint, the benefits of growing cannabis, how to grow it more effectively, and using the techniques learned in cannabis farming for applied to other types of crops. So there's a whole research sector going on that's intriguing and interesting in that space. Now, one of the things that we have the benefit of doing here in New Jersey is addressing the racial and social justice aspect of this. And I saved that for last, but I don't want to diminish the importance of this. The racial and social justice aspect are a focus here in New Jersey for a lot of reasons. One of which, most importantly, and we can jump to the next slide, please, is because what's going on right now in the enforcement of marijuana. One of the indisputable facts right now are communities of color are targets for marijuana enforcement. We've seen this in many, many jurisdictions, but Jersey's not alone in this space. Blacks, Latinos, other persons of color have been targeted, in some cases 4 times more likely than whites, even though there's been no differentiation in terms of those demographics in terms of for marijuana use. So the racial and social justice component have become large drivers, and that's important for both the altruistic reasons that we all should care about, but it's also important if you're a believer in this from an enactment strategy. New Jersey has a very diverse legislature. We are a very diverse population. And in order to move a bill like this through the legislature, one of the things we are going to be focused on is making sure that we end this disparate prosecution of minorities. That's one benefit of legalization, and it has more of a benefit than any other aspect. Medicinal doesn't solve that, and decriminalization, which you may or may not have heard about, means you're only going to get a traffic ticket, the equivalent of a traffic ticket, instead of or an arrest for possession. It still presents tremendous issues around the black market. That will continue to thrive and exist. There's no revenue derived off of that. There's no reinvestment in the communities. There's no job creation, at least in a legitimate job creation that brings you into the sunlight. And the most important thing is it doesn't end the prospect of incarceration, because if you can't pay your fine or if you can't pay your mandated drug treatment, you end up in the system anyway. So there are some concerns over that, and that is one of the drivers right now in our state And if we can skip to the next slide, you'll also see that one other factor in terms of racial and social justice is making sure that the industry that's created looks like our population. And one problem that's existed around the country in terms of legalized states is the ownership of these marijuana companies has been over 80% white-owned and white male-owned. So there's been a push throughout the country to diversify the industry, and that's been a newer push. So Jersey has the ability to adopt some of those progressive policies on the front end of this movement. And again, in terms of enactment strategy, it will be necessary. We're going to need to get members of the Black caucus in the state legislature, members of the Latino caucus in the state legislature to support this bill. So there's a strategy to, develop a proposal that will allow for folks that are underrepresented in this industry to have a seat at the table. And there's a variety of different methods that are going on. Some will be akin to the minority set-asides we already see in place and some small business set-aside efforts. Some are more interesting, talking about micro-licensing and looking at what other jurisdictions have gone on, and some in-state residency requirements and other things that may or may not be explored as this legislation is being developed. But I didn't want to gloss over the fact that certainly diversity is going to be an issue here, both because it is viewed as the right thing to do, but more importantly, in order to get this passed in the legislature, we're going to have to address a lot of those challenges. We can go to the next slide.
Hey, Bill, before we do that, though, I just want to take a quick break to talk about, our first polling question here,
Sure.
which is going to be, do you work or serve clients currently working in the cannabis industry? And we'll just give people a few seconds to weigh in. Please make sure if you're out there that you answer the question. This is how we determine that you are participating in the program and how you will be awarded credit. So we'll give people just a couple more seconds. And I apologize for the interruption. We don't typically have those, so I'm glad we got Bill. We got you back, and we can be good to go here. So, Bill, I don't think you can see this, but most of the responses are in. And if I close out the poll here, looks like only about 11% said yes, and majority 88% said no. Either not currently or maybe not yet. So I guess you'll probably touch on that a bit later. And now we'll move on to talk about licenses.
Yeah, let's jump in. And two things. I'll own the disconnects and the interruptions, guys. I'm in Trenton today, and it's always an experience here in terms of our Wi-Fi capabilities and internet capabilities. So I apologize, but we're making do. Second thing is, let's talk about getting you some clients, because that's, I think, the next step in this world. And let's talk about what's coming, what I think is out there, and what potentially could be. So the licenses, there's a variety of different types of licenses that are related to the marijuana effort, direct. So cultivation, obvious, the grow facilities. In New Jersey, we're going to have in either warehouse or greenhouse space. I doubt that we will have any sort of outdoor grow. There are jurisdictions that allow for that. We don't really have that type of grow season here in our state, but I would also worry that in a state as densely populated as New Jersey, it's one thing where farmers have to go fight the blueberry pickers. I live down in South Jersey where people are stealing corn and blueberries once in a while. It'd be a whole nother effort, right, with trying to protect this. So I think the general consensus here is greenhouse or warehouse for cultivation. And if you are in the real estate space, that's a place to start thinking about, because if you're in a jurisdiction where you have the ability to have favorable treatment from your town governing body, the ability to cite a warehouse, or if you own a warehouse space that Amazon isn't looking at right now, these will become very viable opportunities for you. And there's what they call the cannabis premium on these sites because of the illegality at the federal level. So this become a very, very lucrative venture for some folks. The next license is processing and manufacturing. Variety of different efforts that go on here. The best way I can describe this to you is akin to a candy or food processing manufacturer. Typically what's going on in these facilities are the raw flower, the raw cannabis plant that you see, that you may have had experience back in your youth, or you still do, is turned into something that is more of a manufactured product. It's everything from vaping oil to chocolate bars, gummies, lozenges, sodas, beverages, topical oils, different types of creams, lip balm. I mean, I've basically seen so many different applications now where the plant is being utilized for different delivery vehicles. Generally, the processing is about the same. They use the plant, they turn it into an oil, and then the oil is generally applied to whatever end product they're going to develop. And sometimes the oil is just utilized for the vapor cartridges that are sold. The other obvious component is retail. And so you see these standalone stores that are open. If you've been out to Denver or any of these other jurisdictions, there's standalone stores. You go inside. They're usually very secure. They have security staff on site. And this is the place where you go and you're buying your products, all sorts of different products that are available. We'll have all sorts of those different licenses here in our state. You'll have lab testing. Right now, the state of New Jersey, because of the small scale size of the program, tests the program itself through the state lab. The Department of Health has recommended that we explore outside labs, private sector labs, to help meet the new demand that's going to be created. So I suspect we will have new lab licenses that will be created in due time. There are security components to this, whether they're in-house or there will be separate security efforts. And then transport and delivery, both distribution, supply chain, transport from facility to facility, from processing to retail and the like, certified transport. But there's also a discussion going on right now about home delivery. Basically, if you're familiar with Uber, it would be like the Uber of marijuana, right, where you can dial up or get an app and have it delivered to your home. We can kick to the next slide, please. So in addition to what I just talked about are the obvious spaces, here are some things we may not have thought about. And this is sort of an overview of the ancillary markets that have sprung up. And you see everything from branding companies to the far right, companies that just focus on the branding of cannabis-related entities. You obviously have product companies that are selling different types of either applications or devices that can help in either the smoking of cannabis, the vaping of cannabis, or other things like that. Obviously, a significant amount of investing in holding companies, production companies, data analytics, delivery and subscription and e-commerce marketplace. Compliance tracking is huge in this business. Transaction banking and order management. There is banking. We'll go on to that in a second. But I did want to give you sort of an overview of what this world looks like and what it's growing into. It's fairly significant. We can go to the next slide. So for my friends on the call who are familiar with this, I am no expert. In fact, the rules of professional conduct prevent me from providing advice in violation of federal law, but this is a sticky wicket. The effects of Section 280E really hamstring cannabis businesses because, as you can see, and as you may be aware, it really presents a difficult problem in accounting for business expenses and puts these businesses at a significant disadvantage. Now, there are some, as you can imagine, and I'm sure the experts on this phone call know, there are some tricks here. And the challenge really is to figure out where the sweet spot is and trying to decide what can be legitimately written off and what can't be. What business expenses can be shared, for example, among ancillary businesses vis-a-vis the Champs ruling, in the Champs case of 2007. There's a whole discussion about working up formulas for cost of goods sold and how to account for that. I'm not going to go deep into that. Frankly, I would be outmatched here with the folks on this phone call. I present this to you to issue spot and to start thinking outside the box. There's tremendous innovation going on in the space, particularly for folks of your caliber. If you have comfort in this space and you feel good about this, you can be very helpful to new businesses that are coming in. But if we can jump to the next slide, I do want to warn you that this business is different than everyone else. And there is more scrutiny going on in the marijuana space than other businesses, particularly in terms of audited returns. So this chart, I think, it demonstrates that to some extent. So you do have to be a lot smarter, a lot braver in some respects, but a lot more circumspect about the fact that this is still in violation of federal law. The IRS is more than comfortable of taking in revenue from it. They have no problem doing that. But you have to be very careful about what you are deducting and how, my words, cute you're being with those issues. Let's jump to the next slide. One of the misnomers we hear pretty frequently is nobody's banking. That's not entirely true. In fact, there are some banks, including some banks here in New Jersey, that have already begun to do work in the space. And there are also credit unions that have begun to do work in the space. Typically, the bigger banks are not. But we are seeing more and more enter the market, as this chart demonstrates. And I don't have numbers yet for 2018, but I expect that to jump even more so. Usually what's going on, by the way, is the banks are willing to jump into this now. They are not banking with Bill and Ted's Excellent Potted venture, but they might bank with Caruso LLC, provided that I'm not overt and notorious in the cannabis space. The other thing I will say to you is that there is a premium paid for the banking in this space. And I think that as time goes on, more and more banks are getting more comfortable with this. I do think as time goes on and the federal world changes, and we'll get to that shortly, I think you'll see more and more efforts go on here. If we can jump to the next slide. Here's why. As jurisdictions are becoming increasingly more comfortable with the idea of having legal or medicinal, but certainly medicinal and then legal recreational cannabis in their states, the next obvious issue is, well, we want to make sure it's done safely and smartly. And, making sure that banking is a part of this is paramount. It prevents local crime. That's the number one reason. I mean, there are tremendous amounts of cash flowing here. And, making sure that you have the ability to bank so that these institutions, these cannabis institutions don't become targets for robberies because of the high volume of cash makes a lot of sense. So the ability to bank, the ability to get cash out of the facility into a bank through a secured transaction with armored cars and the like is an important component and has already begun. So that's something that's changing literally day by day now and starting to become more commonplace. Obviously, it helps the local economy. I mean, banks are, in a lot of ways, the cornerstone of a lot of local communities, and having this industry help the banks is important. And, from a business standpoint, it's obvious. And I would say from a, state standpoint, having that certainty where, there's obviously transactions then that are recorded with banks makes a lot of good sense. Let's jump to the next slide. So what's the big holdup? I had this slide in somewhat comical fashion. What about this guy? But I have not, and this has waned a little bit, but I have not been able to have a single conversation about this, particularly in the state legislature, without people asking me about, whoa, what about Jeff Sessions? What about the federal level? What about this Trump administration? And I think I have a different answer now than I did in January. Folks that are familiar, Attorney General Sessions repealed what was called the Cole Memo. The Cole Memo provided some safe harbor to institutions that were involved in cannabis-related businesses. And it basically said they weren't going to go after or prosecute these types of businesses, and that gave some warm and fuzzy feeling to investors and the like. Well, the Attorney General repealed that, and days after, that happened, there were all sort of prognostications of what could happen, and nothing happened. The sky didn't fall. Nothing really changed. States kind of shrugged it off and continued moving down the path. And it's an interesting question now about what that meant to the cannabis movement and what it means to states like New Jersey, what it means to banking, what it means to all the like. And I think what it means is instead of being an impediment, it supercharged the effort at the federal level to start looking at legitimizing this industry at the federal level. So we are seeing on a bipartisan level, and really nothing is moving in Congress on a bipartisan level, but there are efforts moving on both medicinal cannabis and other cannabis-related legislative initiatives in Congress right now. There have been efforts to bolster the medical side of the world. There's been efforts to deschedule or reschedule cannabis so that banking can be allowed. And I think we are on the precipice for allowing a recognition that banking, at least in the medicinal space, must be allowed at the federal level. So I expect movement on that in short time. Where I would have said to you in January or pre-January, it's a half a decade at least until the federal government is going to move on this, at least. I think we might see this in the next 2 years. So there's a lot of movement that's occurred, and actually the session's effort may have, in an odd way, triggered that. I'm not sure that was the intention, but that's where we are. What else is moving? Let's jump to the next slide. The court of public opinion is moving. 63% of American voters support legalization. This is the highest level of support that's ever been recorded. This poll was taken last month. We still have a third of Americans that oppose it, but I'll say this to you: it's hard to get 63% of the public to agree on what day it is, let alone something of this magnitude. So this has been a sea change. There have been polls, about a year or two ago that had us in the high 40s. So this has been significant movement. Support for medical marijuana essentially is higher than clean air right now. We've never seen anything like this, and that also is helping to shape the policy goals in Washington because the Court of Public Opinion is pushing this. We also see some other things that, 70% of the voters do not want the federal government to interfere with states. 60% of voters in our state, New Jersey, think that legalizing marijuana would make money for the state. There's a similar poll out, a similar amount that think that legalization makes sense. When you ask about the money, generally it polls a lot better. There are some error polls that don't necessarily focus on the money, but the revenue drives this just as much as any other issue too, just for the record. Let's jump to the next poll.
Bill, before we do, time for poll number 2 here.
Great.
And let's see how many people were paying attention, because I think we touched on this a little earlier. Are you aware that New Jersey expanded the conditions that qualify for medical marijuana? I think the answer is yes on that one. And, Bill, while we're here, we do have one question I think is a good one. Is a patient, I guess for medical, is a patient required to be a New Jersey resident?
Yes. So one of the things, and we're going to talk about that in the next slide, I believe, we do not have reciprocity. So the only people that are able to be serviced under New Jersey's current program, and unless we change this through statute, I believe, we'll have to see. There's a discussion going on. No one that, if you come in from Nevada or California and you happen to have a medical card, you cannot go to a dispensary here in New Jersey.
Gotcha. Sounds good. And for the polling results are in, and it looks like 67% said yes, they're aware. Now that could be that could be people who just learned of it today, or who had already known of it. So thank you for weighing in. And it looks like we're going to now talk about I guess what's next for New Jersey.
So the governor campaigned on legalization, but we also have a need to expand medicinal. I talked a little bit about what we've done already, and that process is happening, increased demand. But the next 2 steps, and they're going to happen fairly quickly, it appears, we're going to have, I think, almost concurrent tracks to continue expanding medicinal marijuana in New Jersey and to legalize adult recreational use. We'll jump to the next slide on medical expansion. The governor booked $20 million in revenue in the fiscal year 2019 budget this past February, or March, I guess is when it was released. They expect through new sales of marijuana. By the way, parenthetically, just so you know, I think we booked about $2 million in revenue last year. So they have aggressive plans to book a lot more revenue. this year in the expanded medical marijuana program. The current dispensary expansion to satellites has already begun. Some have applied and are beginning to expand. New program regulations and licensing guidelines are due probably next month. So we'll see who can apply, what that expansion is going to look like, and how quick they can move. There's a discussion going on within the governor's office right now about whether or not they can use the emergency powers of the state of New Jersey to expedite the regulatory process so they do not get hung up on a demand-supply issue right now. So that's literally going on as we speak. I talked to you about reciprocity already. One idea would be allow anyone that is a medicinal patient in any other jurisdiction to come into New Jersey and use their card here at one of our establishments. And by the way, currently, if you're registered with one dispensary, you're not able to go to a different dispensary in state, and which seems silly, but they're going to change that as well. Increase in per month limit, permitting edible forms of delivery. So you'd have lozenges, gummies, chocolate bars, sodas, all the different types of edibles that exist. There's some restriction on some of that now. And exploring home delivery, which has some issues with it. Let's go to the next slide. We'll talk about legalization. So legalization, as we talked about, is different. This would be for anyone. This isn't just folks that have a medical ailment that would be recommended by a doctor. Any adult 21 and older in the state or coming in from outside jurisdictions would be able to go into a licensed dispensary and purchase marijuana or marijuana-related products. They booked $60 million in revenue in this upcoming budget. We have new licenses for separate categories likely to be developed. Expungement of past criminal records is going to be important. This is part of the racial and social justice effort. We're working on dealing with that right now. That will make sure that people that had been arrested for possession or use of cannabis previously will have their records wiped. That will allow them not only to get involved in this industry, but also be able to apply for student loans and other things. And people think that's the right thing to do. It's part of enactment strategy. Ideas including inclusion zones and other racial and social equity requirements in the bill, and discussion about consumption spaces. One issue is for public purposes, we want to make sure that there's not outside use of cannabis, particularly smoking. There is a concern of people living in federally subsidized housing. They may not, because of the federal prohibition, be able to consume cannabis in their apartments. So it really comes down to, threading all these different needles and what is a consumption space. This will probably be akin, if you're familiar, to tasting rooms in the beer and wine spaces, in breweries and wineries. If you have a dispensary, there might be an ability to section off, a lounge area where people can consume the product and then go the merry way from there. That's a discussion point going on right now. I do not see that as a new license. It just doesn't seem, Denver explored this, there doesn't seem to be an economic model with opening up a storefront and letting people come in to consume cannabis. There's, not really a market for that. And the insurance costs become significant. And there's been some discussions about whether or not that would be sustainable. Last, I'll get to other factors, if we can jump to that slide. These are big issues that are standing in the way. So I'll jump to the second one. We talked about expungement of criminal records. There's a question about cost. There's a question about feasibility. There's a question about splitting hairs of what if I fled down from a cocaine distribution charge to a marijuana possession charge. And the answer is we're working that out with the courts and prosecutors in solving that right now. Driving under the influence is a big issue. Making sure that we can represent to the public that they'll be safe. There is not a test like a breathalyzer test for cannabis right now. Instead, what will be utilized is the use of a drug recognition expert who will be able to recognize impairment, whether that's impairment from cannabis, alcohol, opioids, Benadryl, what have you. And then the use of a blood test that will test whether or not cannabis is present in your system. And there are some new tests available to test how much is available. The problem is the question of whether or not that's a reliable test to determine on its own whether or not you're actually intoxicated. So the problem with cannabis and marijuana is it stays in your system for many, many weeks, in some cases, many, many days in most. And depending on your body chemistry and makeup, it may stay in you longer than somebody else. So there's not really a lot of science about it. So the use of drug recognition experts and training of drug recognition experts is going to be paramount. Racial diversity in the industry and these set-asides we talked about is important, and making sure we prevent, although we have seemed to practice none in other jurisdictions, underage consumption. So those are the issues right now that we have to grapple with. But I expect both medicinal expansion and legalization of marijuana to come into full view in the next month. And that seems like a daunting task. But the legislature is committed. Our budget is due on June 30th. And we have a constitutional obligation to pass a balanced budget. And with the money booked in this budget, and let me say this to you, lots of revenue needs in this governor's new budget, there is a full press right now to get legalization passed by June 30th. So I expect we're going to see a lot of movement on this in the coming weeks. That is all I have. You folks have been very gracious with your time. I don't know if there are questions for me to answer, but I'd be happy to do so.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. We do have a few minutes left here, and there are just a couple questions. One of them that came in is, I think in reference to the banks, that chart you showed, was that nationwide or just New Jersey?
Nationwide. I apologize. I should have said that. It was nationwide.
How much is the 2 ounce per month limit an impediment to patients who require higher doses?
It's a huge impediment. I'll give you an example. It's a horrible story. There is a story of a young little boy out of Monmouth County who had a terminal ailment. And towards end of life, one of the only things that was helping him with pain management and other things was high amounts of cannabis. And they were running out, forcing their parents to go to the illegal black market. I mean, imagine you're dealing with that, and you're forced to go out and to the street and buy, basically weed from a dealer. What they're looking at, two different levels, increasing it to 4 ounces a month, which is a lot of marijuana, by the way. We're talking about probably fill one of those gallon Ziploc bags. It's about that much, depending on how you're counting it. It's a lot of cannabis. But they're also looking at unlimited amounts for end-of-life use, for hospice care and things of that nature, because it has tremendous pain management values. And you do become more tolerant to it as you go on. So some patients that have been using it for more do require higher doses.
Great. And, a comment here, I haven't seen much advertising campaigns for medical marijuana. Is this in the works?
They haven't had any problem. If the question is about a campaign to help push it forward in the court of public opinion, it's been more grassroots than anything. If it's about advertising for commercial value, they don't have any problem with that right now. They have more than enough demand. And there hasn't been, and there will be rules on marketing. That's one thing that Colorado figured out the hard way. They backed into some rules to make sure there wasn't marketing towards kids and smart marketing out to adults and things of that nature. You're going to see more on public education, if anything, than you will about marketing in the traditional sense. I think you're going to see a lot of issues about don't drive while high, pay attention to your dosing, things of that nature that sprung up in other jurisdictions.
Mm-hmm. And what tax will New Jersey put on it if it's legalized? Something like a sales tax?
It will be a couple. I mean, they're talking about an excise tax, potential sales tax. A graduated tax, I think, is a smart play because that helps to get these new businesses ramped up, and it helps to eliminate the black market. You don't want to create a scenario where it's so overly taxed in the beginning that the black market becomes less expensive and continues to thrive. So there will be tax. There's a discussion going on right now also about allowing for municipalities to levy a local tax, which will allow, we think, for more beneficial treatment in putting these things in different towns. Right now there's been some pushback by mayors, rightfully so, because they want to understand, well, how is money going to flow back to them? And traditionally it doesn't once it goes down to the rat hole in Trenton. So there is some discussion going on in the legislature right now about allowing local taxes as well.
Okay. And with just a couple minutes left, and if you have a few extra minutes, maybe you can stick around because there are a few more.
Sure.
I guess one thing I did want to leave people with, as we get to the end of our time is many of our members, and especially the people on today's call, are working in small or sole practitioners or small to mid-sized firms. What's kind of your one takeaway for someone like that who may have so much opportunity going forward but may not know what to do?
Be careful first. I went to a law firm of about 200 attorneys. It's not necessarily well known for being, on the cutting edge or revolutionary. We're, traditional law firm, and made the case in a play that we needed to be in the space before it was right to be there. I think now it's a little easier to do that because you do see a lot more legitimate businesses out there now exploring this. So internally, I think you've got to sell it. I think you've got to be the agent of change in your space, among your small group, among your partners. Or if you're a standalone practitioner, you just got to sort of buck up and do this and deal with it. And, I've had everything from the neighbor on my block tell other neighbors who didn't want his kids playing with mine because I was involved in this, which is just wild, to current clients of the firm expressing concerns over this. We've gone through all of it. And now where we are is you're in a place where do you go? Where do you go to find clients, right? Well, I think the first thing you want to do is talk to your existing clients. Do they have a nexus here? You've learned a lot, I hope, from this call. You want to think outside the box about who these clients are. I met a guy recently who's in packaging, not for this, by the way, grabbed me in an event, got him up my face, finger in my face, telling me that this is the worst thing for New Jersey. We're not going to be able to hire skilled employees anymore because everybody's going to be high. So I asked him what he did. He told me he was in packaging. And the more we started talking, he then realized he has the potential of being a vendor for one of these companies because he sells this high-end packaging. They do customized design, child-proof, Ziplocs, all the like. And, by the time we were done talking, he realized he might have new clients. So I think the more you're able to out there and educate your clients, right? I mean, we're all in this kind of service world. If we can understand our clients' business and apply this to them, you might have real estate clients. You might have, delivery and transport clients that might have a nexus and interest in this. You'd be surprised at people in New Jersey right now that are poking their head into this to see if they can be involved in this space. So I would say your existing Rolodex of clients, and then, there are trade shows every day, it seems, in this space. It might behoove you to jump into one of these organizations in the state. You can Google, New Jersey Cannabis Industry Association. They're a fairly large group. There's others. Full disclosure, I'm on the board of that organization. So look around, but you'll find ample opportunity to network yourself.
And I think that's a perfect time for us to let everyone know, if you do, want more information on this, we actually have an interest group for it. It's one of our, communities online where, like-minded members can discuss, stay updated. One thing that we do have up there now, which is really cool, is a sample engagement letter, and that's in the online group directory for it. We'll send everyone a link to the interest group so you can go ahead and join it if you would like to, and you can take a look at that engagement letter if you're looking, to move forward in this business. Just so everyone does know, we are not trying to take a position on this. The group is merely just to provide the information and let you guys know where you can go forward if you want to. So we have people on both sides of it, contributing to the discussion. So with that, Bill, there are a couple here, but I guess we are at the time, so I do want to let everyone know that if you don't have a question outstanding, you're welcome to disconnect. We thank everyone for attending. I do hope this was informative. I know I definitely learned a lot out of it. And I guess this does wrap up our final Hot Topics webinar for the 17-18 season. So I hope you did. If you were a Hot Topics Web Pass subscriber, I hope you did enjoy it. We've been doing this for a few years now. If you aren't, or even if you are, we do have the current one for 18-19 available online. We have increased the number of credits and kept the price the same. So that's a pretty good deal. If you don't know about it, it's 12 webinars, one a month, And there's special pricing now for all members at $99, and that's good till June 30th. Otherwise, it'll go up a little bit. So definitely want to take a look at that. We'll send you a link with an email. And I did get a question here about CPE credits. You'll get an email with your credit letter. It's just going to take a few days or so. So keep an eye out for that. And don't forget to fill out the evaluation. Let us know what you think today. So with that, thank you everyone for attending. You're welcome to disconnect. And Bill, if you have a couple minutes, we'll stay on the line for those final questions.
Sure thing.
Great. So let's see what's standing out here. What else do we have here? Bill, will the FDA get involved in this?
We don't know. So it's actually an interesting question. The Colorado regulators, when they were working on packaging issues, they wanted to put recommendations that were standardized for packaging. You know, states don't regulate that. So they reached out to the FDA for guidance, even though the FDA won't regulate it because it's illegal. And they had this sort of stalemate. And the FDA unofficially weighed in with Colorado regulators to provide some uniform guidance, but it wasn't done in an official way. So until and unless, this really goes back to this federal issue, until and unless the federal government changes its views on this, no, I don't see the FDA playing a role yet. They will ultimately.
Okay, and how will, hopefully you know what this means, how will MJ laws affect firearms permitting? I've read that some states are denying firearms licenses for people with medical cards.
Yeah, so the MJ laws is this person is clearly a pro. Marijuana laws was the question, and how they're going to impact firearms applications, and it's a question. I think that's starting to change. In the initial stages, there were some questions about whether or not they would approve these firearms. I've seen some states now that have changed their view. The problem is, because it's still illegal at federal level, there are some concerns about approving firearms for folks that are technically breaking federal law by using cannabis. You know, this is a problem that ultimately is solved if the federal government provides more guidance or provides relaxed views on cannabis. But I do think you're starting to see some states work through those issues. And, you know, listen, if the blanket question is, are there people with guns that are using cannabis legally? Yes. The answer is yes.
Mm-hmm. Any idea what the rate will be? I'm guessing that's purchase price.
Yeah, you mean the tax rate? Hello? Yeah.
Yeah. It's hard to say. I can't recall when that question came in. I don't know if it was talking about actual, buying prices or the tax rate.
Yeah, let's do the rate, because I've heard that question. The answer is we don't know. I mean, I've heard as high as 20%, but I don't know how that gets whacked up either. And I don't know, like I said to you before, in an aggregate, will they allow for a local tax on top of that? But we're not there yet. We're working through that, I think, at the state legislative level right now.
Mm-hmm. And then final question here. So Section 280E allows for cost of goods sold, but not ordinary business expenses. How about a cost of goods sold management fee to another LLC?
Yeah, there are people doing that, and again, this is way outside of my wheelhouse. This is what I've read on the internet, so take this with that type of grain of salt. And I am absolutely prohibited from, one, because I'm not competent, and two, because our rules of professional conduct prevent us from providing advice in this respect. I have heard this done. I think this is one of the avenues. I think you can learn a lot. This is one of these areas where the more you spend time on the internet, and buyer beware there, you're going to learn a lot more about what other people are doing anecdotally. Most of this stuff is applied through the efforts of people trying it, and then this worked. There's not a lot of good practices that are just sort of coming off the shelf. These are being developed as we speak right now. So I think that absolutely is one of the ways I think folks are dealing with 280E right now for these businesses, and I think that has become more commonplace. But I would urge you to go explore that more deeply, particularly given the fact that the folks I'm talking to are more expert at this level than I am.
Or join the interest group we have.
Absolutely. And listen, I think it's definitely a great spot for you guys to start thinking about together, because this is one of the largest outstanding concerns right now. And whoever cracks this nut, I mean, I can tell you the most established businesses in the cannabis space right now, this is what keeps them up at night. And so if you have the ability to provide, some guidance, particularly for the new folks coming in here that are going to be starting up, this is a great place to carve out some territory for yourself.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot for the guidance, Bill. This definitely has been super helpful. Sounds like you are on the go, so we will definitely let you go here. We appreciate the extra time that you spent with us today, and look forward to having you back here.
Guys, it was my pleasure, and thanks for the opportunity.